Hello there. Happy Wednesday. I get to join you usually on Wednesday evenings now and share so much of what I've been reading and learning with my team at Re+active. And during this month, it's been Functional Neurologic Disorder Awareness Month. And so you all know this is my passion area and what I read a lot about. In fact, boy, wait until next week because there was a whole publication, seminars in pediatrics that just came out all on FND in kids. And we work with a lot of kids with FND. So I can't wait to talk about that one. But today I'm doing a carryover from last week on an article that just really blew my socks off, had so many good things in it. And of course, I want to share it with you here. Let me just show you a peek of the article, Functional Neurologic Disorder, New Subtypes and Shared Mechanisms. Last week, I talked about some of the key components in this article that I love, particularly the mechanistic piece. And I really firmly believe is that understanding the pathophysiology and the mechanisms help you understand the assessment and treatment approach. I think it's so key. So we talked about mechanisms. We didn't talk so much about subtypes and particularly diagnosis. So this is what I really want to hit on today. So I'm going to share a different picture here for you. And that is this one. I know it's tiny if you're watching this on your phone, but let me explain it to you. And I'm going to go piece by piece a little bit here to explain it. So first of all, if you're new with us, I didn't even say hello. My name is Julie Hirschberg. I'm a neurologic physical therapist and the owner and founder of Re+active Therapy and Wellness in the Los Angeles area. Hugely passionate about functional neurologic disorders. And if this is new to you, a functional neurologic disorder, I gave a new definition last week from this paper that I really love. And I'm going to read it to you. A functional neurologic disorder is a clinical syndrome consisting of symptoms and signs genuinely experienced with alterations in motor, sensory, cognitive performance that are distressing or impairing, and manifest one or more patterns of deficits that are consistent or predominant with dysfunction of the nervous system and show variability in performance within the same task and between different tasks. It's a longer definition than maybe I had seen earlier, but I really love it. It's really all encompassing. Another shorter way of saying some of that is that a functional neurologic disorder is a condition where the primary pathophysiology are alterations in the functioning or connections in the nervous system and between the brain and body, rather than an alteration in brain structure. And last week we talked about that a little bit more and what that actually looks like in the brain, those changes in connection. So today in part 2 is I want to talk about these diagnostic criteria and talk about these different subtypes of functional neurologic disorders. So at the top of this table, you'll see functional seizures. So functional seizures are a type of seizure that are due to a connectivity issue, alterations in brain connectivity. They have very distinct characteristics that can be found on testing. So one of the main points that I want to get through here is that all of these different types of functional neurologic disorders can be shown through positive testing. So we know that there are differences in an EEG, for example, in somebody with seizures versus functional seizures. What this table also shows us is that it shows the established diagnostic features and some new things out in the literature. So things for functional seizures is here's some really interesting articles. You'll see several articles cited in this table, and I went through many of these in the past week. So actually looking at the conversations and the responses to questions during a clinical interview is very sensitive and specific for functional seizures. Really interesting. Use of a smartphone video to look at the different types of movement that occur. Same with wearing a wrist-worn accelerometer. It actually very much shows differences in patterns of movement between a functional seizure and a seizure, and these can help differentiate these. Finally, really interesting article, and so interesting that I'm actually going to put it in our newsletter this week. So by the way, if you're not already on our newsletter, you should join it. I send out a summary with all my videos and links and things at the end of the week. And I put this particular article in because I was like, what is this? I haven't read about it. And it's these post-ictal plasma protein levels. They've basically been able to find differences in these plasma proteins between a seizure and a functional seizure. That is so fascinating to me. You may be wondering, like, if you don't work with people with seizures, which honestly, I don't work with a lot of people with seizures, except for functional seizures, among other functional neurologic disorders, and also some people that have other seizures. The ictal phase is the period of time, the middle of the seizure. So from the first symptoms, which might also have an aura type thing, to the end of the seizure phase. So post-ictal would be testing those plasma proteins afterwards. And they actually found differences in the level of plasma proteins in that post-ictal phase between seizures and functional seizures. Now, this is in the research stage of things. People aren't necessarily looking at this right now, but what they stated in this article was that this could be really helpful for people to use in the emergency room, because often what happens is we miss the seizure, like we miss the functional seizure or the seizure, but we could catch this in plasma testing of protein levels and inflammatory markers after the seizure. Super interesting. So that's that piece on the functional seizures. The second there is tremor. Very common type of functional movement disorder, probably the most common that we see here at Re+active. And we know that there are some positive signs like an entrainment test, the variability in frequency and amplitude of the tremors. But there are some newer pieces that have been shown to also be sensitive to tremor. So the whack-a-mole sign, I've talked about that one before. And then they've also done some physiologic testing looking at the antagonist and agonist muscle activation patterns. So those are two other, again, positive findings for a positive diagnosis. What about dystonia? I love working with people with dystonia. I got to be really honest. I love dystonia. I love working with functional dystonia as well. And in the past, what we understood is that a more fixed dystonia was more likely to be functional, but we understand even more about some of the patterns that are very specific to functional dystonia. So particularly in the face, there are very specific patterns that have been actually around. This particular article that they're looking at from John Stone and his colleagues, like since the 1800s, some of these very specific facial patterns of dystonia are positive indicators of a functional dystonia. Isn't that fascinating? They have looked at this since the 1800s. I love the brain. It's so interesting. Okay, so other subtypes here. Gait and balance dysfunction, also something really common that we see here at Re+active. I think most therapists do. So we know that variability, use of external focus, some specific gait patterns can indicate a functional characteristic of the gait. We now know that you could classify these into several types. Also looking at changes with the breath. Hello, autonomic nervous system, right? So breath holding with the gait is another big piece. And then also looking at posturography. So the balance responses are different with an external focus. Not surprising because we understand attention as part of the underlying issue. Jerks and myoclonus, another common one that we see, very disturbing for people to have jerks in their trunk or their arm. In a functional myoclonus, we have new understanding of what this might look like, including testing for a startle response. So this is something that we definitely see as well, that can indicate that this is more of a functional myoclonus. And then finally, weakness. Weakness is a really common pattern in functional movement disorders, and we can actually see this now in physiologic testing. Again, this is primarily done in the research world, but things that start there start also occurring in the real world. And honestly, these are some of the tests that help also rule out peripheral neuropathies or ALS or a muscular dystrophy, right? So you would do EMG and nerve conduction studies and actually have particular findings like absence of an amplitude suppression in median nerve. Now, this is in a somatosensory evoked potential, not in an EMG. But the fact that we can actually test these out and have a positive diagnosis again is really important. Now, I think not only the testing piece, but how this is discussed with the person is so important. And I've chatted about this before. There's a really great article, also by John Stone and his colleagues, that literally has videos of how to and how not to make the diagnosis and how to talk about it. Because it's one thing to have these positive findings and it's another to actually help explain them to a person. One of the things that I love actually in this video by John Stone, they actually demonstrate a person who has a functional tremor, and there's some variability in that tremor, and sometimes the tremor stops and sometimes it doesn't, and that really helps the neurologist to explain that there is a connection issue, a functioning issue in the nervous system versus a structural deficit, which would truly cause that tremor to be the same the whole time, right? So really lovely way of doing that. I'll include a link to that article as well, because it's also one of my favorites. Now, I want to share one more thing with you, and it's something that we just put out. And I apologize. I feel like I'm scrolling here. I am. But I wanted to share with you, I've gotten so many great questions from other healthcare providers, from people with FND, really asking a lot of great questions. And that really excites me because my heart just bleeds for FND and for healthcare providers to be really well informed about this disorder. So we put together all of our functional neurologic disorders resources into one big resource for people, so that we have a webinar on FMD made simple. We have a cheat sheet so you could get started in your assessment. We have, I see somebody who has so many questions. Fire away. I'm going to take questions today. I also have some questions that people submitted, so please send me questions. I love questions, and I love talking with you all. So we have a webinar. We have an assessment cheat sheet with that bundle. We have some of our assessment handout tips. So we have a sensory mapping one. So if you weren't sure how you might test some of the higher order sensations, we have a sensory mapping one that actually goes into treatment. And speaking of treatment, we have some of my favorites. So that sensory mapping one, it's a great place to start for sensation. We have a sensory grounding tip sheet that takes you through a really great practice that I would say try it yourself. Also try it with the people that you're working with. And then we have our autonomic downloads. These are downloads, audio downloads that Naoya Ogura, our OT and clinic director, has created for you. So I highly recommend those. I recommend this bundle. It's a great resource if you're just getting started with FND. I missed something, and it's my favorite thing. It's kind of where it all began. It's the River Runneth Over handout. I can't believe I forgot that. Oh my gosh, I love this, and I use it all the time. This was something that Chelsea and Mike Studer and Carly Lockala and I put together when we talked about FND at CSM just before the pandemic hit, and it has been so valuable in us helping to understand where a person is and their understanding of FND and that idea of nervous system regulation and how our nervous system stays regulated. So that is part of this bundle. Super helpful. So now I'm getting some questions and comments here. Hey, Paige, she says thank you. And then, okay, good question. You mentioned strength. I have dystonia and I'm trying to find the balance between strength and stretching and yoga. I feel like I need exercise. Every day is probably what that's going to say. And yeah, so great question. And I think this is a really common one with dystonia and other neurologic disorders, to be honest, is finding the right balance. Here's one thing that I will tell you that's true for functional neurologic disorders and many disorders and dystonia is that we need those things. We need strengthening, we need stretching. One of the things the brain really needs is blood flow. So aerobic exercise, it needs dopamine and BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factors. Both of these can come from strengthening exercise, but highly from aerobic exercise and highly from goal-directed activities, particularly externally focused. So one of the things that can come from a strengthening or stretching routine is that it's very internally focused, like squeeze this muscle, tighten your core, squeeze your glutes. Whereas a goal-directed external focus may be like reach the ceiling, right? Or play this sport or do this task. Those externally focused activities can really help drive neuroplasticity for many disorders, but especially dystonia. Lay those down in a substrate where your brain is super happy, lots of BDNF flowing, lots of great blood flow, with aerobic exercise, good fitness routine, lots of good sleep, not too much sleep, but getting a good solid sleep every night, good regular sleep. This is the substrate for neuroplasticity. This is how we make brain changes. And when you have a neurologic disorder and you're doing rehab, you're looking for brain changes, right? So you want to have those pieces in place. So what a great question. Thank you so much. Put more in here. I'm happy to answer them. I'm going to go to 6 o'clock because then I'm going to be making some dinner for my family. And I want to answer some other questions that came up. Somebody asked with this idea of attention. Attending to movement can often make the movement or the muscle contraction or the dystonia or the pain worse. Now, somebody asked, what if my movement gets better with attention? What does that mean? So I think this is a really good question. Now, I think I'd want to see that and test it out. Like, what actually gets better? Is it the feeling that you have about the movement? Is it actually the movement quality? Is that you reached the goal that you wanted to reach? I'd want to know, first of all, that piece. And second, it may be that for you and your body actually needs a little interoception. So interoception is that kind of internal sense of self and feeling and focus on that self. And for some people, it's kind of low, and maybe they've actually been kind of not feeling their body well, not attending to their body well. And that person may actually need more attention to it. Now, the motor learning theory from neurologic disorders to sports performance will tell us that the movement of attention away to an external focus and a goal is absolutely superior for motor learning. But it's not necessarily superior for performance in the moment. So when we're talking about that principle, we've got to balance it, right? So performance in the moment, you might actually do better with an internal focus. Motor learning in the long run, external focus all of the way. But we've got to think too about the person that maybe is a little detached and unaware of their body. They may need that focus and attention on their body too. So what a great question. I learned so much from you. Oh my gosh. Somebody else had asked in functional neurologic disorders, what about blood flow? What about blood flow to the legs or the limbs? So somebody asked this who I think maybe is feeling less blood flow. Maybe their legs feel cold. Maybe they have some dysregulation in the legs, which definitely occurs particularly if your muscles aren't pumping very much because you have a functional weakness or functional paralysis. Absolutely. Also can happen if you have autonomic dysfunction. So that's something that we want to look at. We see a lot of people with FND who may also have POTS, or may have another form of an autonomic neuropathy even. And so we have to take that into consideration in looking at blood flow. Now, here's the good news. All of the movement, the sensory input, all of those pieces are beneficial for blood flow. So the weight bearing component, absolutely, because you're going to get some of the automatic activity in the legs. Even sitting up on a higher surface so the legs are activated. All of those things can help improve blood flow too. And for some people, we may also recommend that they wear compression garments to help with that blood flow. Now, again, this is not medical advice, right? I'm answering your questions to get you connected to resources, but there are people where it would be contraindicated to wear compression devices. You should not just go out and get compression socks, everybody. Same with the question about aerobic exercise. It might not be safe for everybody to aerobically exercise. They might have exercise intolerance and it can flare symptoms. So that is something to be really careful about. And I recommend working very specifically with your therapist to progress that routine. Okay, somebody else said you recommended a leg to stand on. I'm so glad. They said they got it and read it. It's one of my favorite books. I recommend it to a lot of people. So this just makes me so happy that you read it. This is the book by Oliver Sacks, where essentially he experiences a functional neurologic disorder after an injury to his leg, and he also recovers from it. And if you remember in that book, one of his big things was this external focus and into the pool, right? And not thinking about his leg, and not thinking, how do I contract this muscle, right? As soon as he stopped doing that is when he started to make his recovery. So incorporating an external focus, I think exploring those things that you really love, right? So it's not the same for everybody. Dribbling and shooting a basketball, I don't know that all people care about that. I will tell you, one of my favorites from was it just yesterday? It was yesterday. I was working on standing posture with somebody, and really challenging for them to stand upright. So we've been eating a lot of jelly beans because of the Easter holiday. And so we were just playing a jelly bean toss to catch it in the mouth. That external focus actually really unlocked movement for this person. It was incredible. Head upright, trunk upright, and they could access that movement. That's what we're looking for in functional neurologic disorders. The movement, the capabilities are there. We just have to find ways creatively together to help a person access what is there. So that's a big component of our intervention. Really great question there. Okay, there's a couple more questions that people sent in to me. I hope I can get to all of them here. Somebody asked, what if something happens during the course of a treatment with somebody, like they have a fracture? Well, hello, this happens, right? People with all neurologic disorders may end up with a fall or a fracture, or they were out doing sports and they fell on an outstretched arm and they fractured their wrist. It's absolutely going to happen, and it is incorporated into treatment. You also are going to have a nervous system response to a physical injury, and we're going to incorporate that piece into treatment. I think it's really important too to screen for orthopedic physical injuries in all of our people with neurologic disorders, because in my experience, it's really just one system that's involved: cardiovascular, endocrine, immune, musculoskeletal. We usually see the overlap of all of that. So it's so important. Okay, another great question. How may the cognitive piece affect the movement, especially if there's slow processing? So, can I say to be continued on this one? Because the cognitive to motor piece is really complex, and I really want to spend some time talking about functional cognitive dysfunction, particularly because it can be an overlay on a cognitive disorder. So it's common. Is that wild? It's common, and it can significantly impair function because they're not really separate, right? All of these systems are so intertwined. When we even think about movement and plan it, like that's our cognitive system before we execute it, right? And so again, when there's slowed processing, slowed cognition, changes in executive function, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but we're going to bring the external focus back, because one way to unlock movement is to go back to the automatic, go deep to the procedural memory that's kind of hiding out under all that slow processing, and unlock it. Again, it's going to be different for everybody. We unlocked it the other day with a jelly bean toss for a young kiddo with a functional neurologic disorder, but it's there. And even under slowed cognition and slowed processing speed, we can unlock an automatic movement pattern. And actually, it's the less automatic movement pattern that can be contributing to the slowed processing. Because just imagine, this is what occurs for most people with neurologic disorders, where they've experienced a decline in their motor sensory functions. And now when they go to take a step, they're like, move my hip, move my knee, move my ankle, move my leg, move my arm this way, move my trunk this way. They are thinking a million things just to move their foot. Now, that is not how the brain was designed. It was not designed to think about each of those things with each movement. So one of the ways that we can help people access movement is to shift that pattern. Now, it makes sense that that pattern would occur after an injury. It's protective. That's what the brain should do. But to have it persist is not helpful. And so we actually, again, unmask movement by providing an external focus, a very salient external focus, so that the person has access to the movement that they are capable of. I'm so thankful for you all and these great questions. So to be continued, we're going to talk about functional cognitive disorders and that cognitive motor interface for sure. We're going to talk about the Seminars in Pediatrics recent edition just from April, all about functional neurologic disorders in kids. This is like, I know I have a lot of passions. Let me have a lot of passions. I say I love everything, but I love functional neurologic disorders. I love also working with kids and their families. So double passion for me. And in the meantime, I kind of left this up here. I put all of our resources together. This is like 5 years of our resources all in one bundle. A webinar, our assessment cheat sheet, our treatment tip sheets, all for functional neurologic disorders. If you're just getting started, this is a really good place to start. If you have a functional neurologic disorder, some of these resources may be like, what is she even talking about? Bring them to your providers and educate them and get curious about what you might be doing in therapy too. So I want to thank you so much for joining me tonight in this FND Awareness Month and us getting to all of this great literature and to answering your questions. Keep sending me questions too. I just want to make sure I got everything here. I think I did. Keep sending questions my way. I'd love to keep answering them. I hope you have a really great evening and I will see you again soon. Thank you.